I'm Alma, by the way.
Tobias.
The trip that they'd planned to go on that evening. But unlike all the other times that Mike had gone duck hunting, this time he didn't come home when he said he was going to. So early that afternoon, Denise starts calling friends and family to see if anyone had heard from him or possibly had seen him. And like I said earlier, one of the first people that she called was Brian's father, Marcus. And when Marcus heard that Mike hadn't come home, he calls Brian to alert him of the situation, and Brian, being Mike's best friend, he instantly dropped what he was doing and went out with his father to search for Mike. And they knew from speaking with Denise that Mike had gone out to Lake Seminole, which was about an hour away, and so that's where they went to begin their search. Other friends and family also joined in, but it was ultimately Brian and Marcus who ended up spotting Mike's truck and his trailer parked up alongside the boat landing. And obviously this discovery instantly made their hearts sink, because if Mike's truck and his trailer were there, but Mike and his boat were not, that instantly made them think that something bad may have happened out on the water, which ultimately ended up becoming the predominant theory when it came to Mike's disappearance. So they reported their findings to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, who arrived by 4 p.m. that evening. And once they got there, they started what would end up being one of the largest search efforts that Lake Seminole had ever seen. And well into that evening, friends, family, and the FFWCC searched by land, water, and air. They also even brought in cadaver dogs to help assist them. And late that night, another discovery was made. Brian and his dad came across Mike's boat, but there was still no sign of Mike himself, which only, of course, worsened everybody's fears. And by the time they made this discovery, a cold front had come over the area and temperatures dropped into the low 20s. So now there was concern that even if Mike had fallen into the water somehow and had washed up on shore and was possibly still alive, that he wouldn't be able to survive the colder temperatures. Which, another thing that you guys have to understand too is Lake Seminole is massive. It's actually a reservoir, and it contains over 37,000 acres of water. So when I talk about the search efforts and not being able to find him and what a challenge it was to try and find him, I'm not talking about some tiny little lake with just a few miles of shoreline. It actually has 376 miles of shoreline, so definitely not something that they could cover in a day or even a week, which meant that they had to use any clues that they could get to try and figure out where Mike was. And obviously, the boat was a big clue. Members of the FFWCC took note of everything that was in there, which included 2 life jackets, his shotgun, which was still zipped up in its case, and some duck decoys. They also noted that the motor was dead, but there was a full tank of gasoline. And so all of these clues led to the belief that whatever happened to Mike happened relatively quickly. I mean, if his gas tank was full and his gun was still zipped up in its case, he probably didn't make it very far before whatever happened, right? And at this point in time, they figured whatever had happened was an accident of some sort. Also, it's really important to note that before this, 79 other people had fallen into Lake Seminole, and all of them had drowned. So it seemed like a fair assumption that the same thing probably happened to Mike. So the theory quickly became that he was driving the boat out, he hit some sort of like floating log or branch below the surface of the water, and he was flung over the edge of the boat. And because they believed that he was wearing his waders, the idea was that they filled with water quickly and pulled him under before he got the chance to get free. Now, if you are a regular true crime consumer, or maybe someone who is familiar with boating, or maybe someone with just general common sense, this whole theory probably isn't adding up to you, because earlier I mentioned that the gas tank on his boat was still full, and then I also mentioned that the theory is that he was flung over the side of the boat while it was moving. And if you're not picking up why this is strange, let me explain. The boat couldn't have just magically shut itself off, right? So for this scenario to be true, the boat would have had to run out of gas. But for whatever reason, everyone seemed to just accept that this was the most logical theory for what happened to him, and didn't even question the whole gas thing. So they ended up combing through 5 acres of the lake, 1 square foot at a time, trying to find Mike's body, which they were convinced was somewhere in the water. And they actually used PVC pipe to poke along the bottom of the lake, because if his body was down there, then they would be able to feel it. And I watched a clip of a guy who was part of the search doing this particular work with the PVC pipe, And he explained, because I had actually never heard of using PVC pipe for a water search. I'm sure it is pretty common. I just haven't heard of it. But he explained that when you poke down, that if they were to hit a body, it would feel like a pillow. It feels soft. Versus if they hit a rock or a log or something, it would feel hard. But after days of doing this, they still didn't find anything.
We are back. It's the Victoria's Secret Fashion Show 2024 featuring live performances by K-pop sensation Lisa, singer-songwriter.
Shannon Gail Christian was a brilliant and charming young woman born April 29, 1985. She was in her senior year at the University of Tennessee, on track to graduate in December of that year. Shannon was the only daughter to parents Gary and Dina Christian. She had a loving older brother named Chase. When she was a little girl, Shannon's family moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, and settled in West Knoxville, building a strong and loving middle-class life. Shannon was known for lighting up rooms with her beautiful smile, gentle and loving heart, and fun-loving spirit. She shared a special bond with her mother and loved playing golf with her family. According to her mother, she grew up on this golf course, following her brother and her daddy and us playing, and she finally decided that she wanted to play. Shannon had her whole life ahead of her, and she planned everything out to the specific detail. Her dream was to follow in her mom's footsteps and become a loving mother with no more or less than 4 kids. The first of which would be a boy, to be a wonderful big brother just like she had growing up. Along with her love and passion for golf, there was one thing she loved more than anything else: her significant other, Christopher Newsom. According to her mother, Dina, "I know Chris had fallen pretty hard, and I know she was very happy. She was my best friend."
Hugh Christopher Newsom Jr., known as Chris, was born on September 21st, 1983 in Knoxville, Tennessee. He has been characterized as a hard-working and modest young man. He was your average Knoxville boy who loved sports and outdoor activities like fishing, baseball, tennis, and golf. Growing up, Chris was full of energy and had a sweet and caring heart and a creative and artistic mind. His mother described him as a talented baseball player who picked up the game at the age of 4. Chris was known for his love of creating artwork, especially wood creations. After graduating from Halls High School, a severe injury sidelined his passion for baseball, and so Chris became a motorcycle mechanic. But his love for woodworking never faded away. He pursued carpentry to become a true craftsman. His mother loved boasting about a beautiful headboard that he made her entirely by hand. In 2006, Chris met his soulmate Shannon through mutual friends. They hit it off immediately. Before they knew it, they were introduced to each other's families. Their courtship was blossoming, and they were enjoying every moment of it. But on one night in January, their blissful life took a very tragic turn.
January 7th, 2007 was just a normal Sunday morning for the Newsom family until they received a call from Shannon's parents. Shannon, the responsible and driven daughter, had not shown up to work, and Chris, her date from the night before, was not answering his phone. The Newsoms hadn't expected him home as he planned to spend the night with a friend, but the situation was becoming more worrisome by the minute. The Christians were in the same boat. They knew that their daughter would never just disappear. Something wasn't right, and their instincts told them they needed to act. However, when they contacted local law enforcement, they were told that the 2 were adults and were free to go missing.
The parents were dissatisfied with the lack of action from the authorities, so they decided to take matters into their own hands. They became the primary investigators in the search for their children, doing all they could to locate them. The couple was last seen at the Washington Ridge apartment complex where Shannon's best friend lived. They made numerous phone calls to family, friends, hospitals, and other places that might have information. Finally, Shannon's parents discovered her phone had last pinged a cell phone tower near northeast Knoxville on Cherry Street. This lead gave them hope. They organized a community search party. Friends and family of both individuals gathered, and they searched the surrounding area street by street.
Simply put, cancer starts with one cell going bad. but by the time it's been diagnosed, there may be 100 different kinds of cancer in a patient. Basically, circumstances and luck.
After hours of searching, they found Shannon's Toyota 4Runner SUV abandoned at an intersection near Chipman Street. It was a chilling sight for the parents. Window stickers had been stripped off, the driver's seat pushed far back, and the car doors mysteriously wiped down, even though the floorboards were loaded with mud. The worst fears of the parents slowly crept in as they suspected that something terrible had happened to their kids. The search for their missing children had just begun, but the mystery surrounding their disappearance was only becoming more complicated and puzzling. Parents were determined to find out what had happened to their children, and they wouldn't rest until they had uncovered the truth. The families were anxious and on the edge of their seats as they waited for any updates on their missing loved ones. It was not until law enforcement discovered an out-of-place envelope in the abandoned vehicle that they finally took the case seriously. It was addressed to a home on Chipman Street, and it was covered in fingerprints. The families pled with the authorities to start doing door-to-door searches, but their requests were denied. Exhausted and distraught, they watched as the police followed their standard procedures as precious hours started slipping away.
The next day, the Newsomes prayed for good news, but their hopes were shattered when a sergeant, investigator, and chaplain arrived at their front door. The air was tense as the families braced for what they discovered next. They had found Chris's body near the railroad tracks in East Knoxville. Forensic evidence would later reveal that Chris had been brutally SA'd in the final hours of his life. He had been bound with his belt, gagged with his socks, with his hands secured behind his back, and his head tied up in a bandana covered in a sweatshirt tied around his neck with shoestrings. He was then forced to walk down the railroad tracks like some sort of sick game. He was shot in the back and the neck, and as he lay there paralyzed and disoriented, his assailant shot him execution style with a .22 caliber handgun. They took their time and ensured he suffered. It was neither quick nor painless. After executing Chris, they wrapped his body in a comforter, doused him in gasoline, and then set him ablaze. After discovering Chris's body in the suspicious envelope in Shannon's vehicle, the authorities had enough evidence to execute a search warrant. On Tuesday, January 9, 2007, the police stormed the residence located at 2316 Chipman Street in Knoxville. Through the search, they managed to locate Shannon's remains. She had been hogtied with strips of fabric from a bedding set. Her body was then encased in black garbage bags, with her head wrapped in a white plastic grocery bag. Forensic evidence showed that her assailants had repeatedly and violently SA'd the young woman in all ways possible, and her private areas showed injuries consistent with such an attack. She also suffered 2 blows to the head and had bleach sprayed down her throat in a possible effort to destroy leftover DNA evidence. After all of this, and even being bound and stuffed into a garbage container, Shannon survived her attack. She was left to die, slowly and painfully, until she ultimately asphyxiated inside of the trash can.
The authorities were completely caught off guard. It was a sight they had never seen before, and one that some officers said would haunt them forever. They immediately sprang into action, and in the coming weeks, they worked around the clock to apprehend the 5 suspects who were connected to this heinous crime. These suspects were named Lamarcus Slim Davidson, Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, Vanessa Lynn Coleman, and Eric Boyd. These weren't ordinary suspects. They were dangerous individuals. The authorities were determined to bring them to justice. However, the community was not ready for the gruesome details that would be brought to light. January 11, 2007, they detained and interviewed Lamarcus Davidson and Eric Boyd. Eric had tried to hide Lamarcus, who was the alleged ringleader and a notorious drug dealer. Lamarcus would later tell law enforcement, "Selling dope, that's what I do." He was on parole after being in prison for 5 years for carjacking and robbery charges. To make matters worse, Lamarcus was already suspected of committing a series of robberies around the community.
I like hoops and hit.
I love training, and I love hitting the treadmill.
I love the cardio.
His brother, Latalvis Cobbins, was visiting from Kentucky, and with him he brought his friends George Thomas and Vanessa Coleman, none of whom had jobs, money, or vehicles. Late January of that year, a grand jury in Knox County indicted them on 46 different charges, including kidnapping, robbery, theft, essay, and homicide. Trials that followed spanned about a decade. The details that would emerge in these trials were far beyond what anyone imagined. It was a crime so pervasive that it would change the community forever. Eric Boyd has always maintained his innocence in the couple's abduction, but with no forensic evidence tying him to the crimes, the authorities were left to prosecute him for aiding and abetting LaMarcus Davidson and hiding after the incident. However, Eric's statement to the authorities contained some surprising and striking details of the carjacking. He insisted that the information came purely from LaMarcus and not his own memory.
It was a dark and quiet night at Washington Ridge, but little did Shannon and Chris know that their peaceful evening would be interrupted. Eric Boyd arrived at the parking lot with his accomplices, LaMarcus Davidson and LaTalvis Cobbins. As soon as Eric and LaMarcus stepped out of their car, leaving LaTalvis behind, they were ready to execute their plans to carjack the couple. However, just as they were approaching the couple with guns drawn, the headlights of another vehicle suddenly turned on and caught them off guard. In a frenzy, they pushed Shannon and Chris into the SUV and sped off into the night. After overpowering the couple, the small crew hastily secured them in the back of Shannon's SUV, using whatever cords they could find to bind them tightly. With LaMarcus at the wheel of the SUV and LaTalvis following closely behind in a car borrowed from Eric's cousin, the group made their way back to LaMarcus's home on Shipman Street. Once back at the residence with the kidnapped couple, an argument erupted between the five assailants, particularly between George Thomas and LaMarcus, who were mostly unknown to each other and had pre-existing hostility. According to Vanessa Coleman, LaMarcus told Thomas that he was gonna need him to do something so he could trust him.
To gain Shannon's cooperation and buy more time, they dangled the promise of freedom in front of her. Made her believe she could and would be free to go, but only if she agreed to their demands. Shannon made a call to her parents, creating a false alibi to ensure that nobody would be the wiser. After this, LaMarcus, LaTalvis, Eric, and George put Chris into the back of the 4Runner and left Shannon behind with Vanessa. It was unclear who had assaulted Chris or at what point this occurred, but forensic evidence showed he had been SA'd. Eric had long been suspected of being the perpetrator, as computer forensics had found adult material depicting men found on his phone, but police lacked enough evidence to charge him with it. After the attack, they took Chris from the back of the vehicle near the railroad tracks running along Shipman Street. Chris's mouth gagged and a sweatshirt tied around his neck. LaMarcus forced George to take the first shot, hitting Chris in the neck. As he fell, he was shot again in the back. As Chris lay on the tracks paralyzed, LaMarcus came up and pressed the gun to his head and pulled the trigger, killing him instantly.
While Shannon lay tied up in a bedroom, unaware of her boyfriend's fate, George and LaMarcus removed their bloody clothes. After changing, they gathered up a comforter and a gas can and returned to the scene of the crime. They wrapped his lifeless body in the comforter, soaked it in gasoline, and then set his body ablaze. While the two were attempting to cover up their crime, LaTalvis went into the bedroom where Shannon was being held captive. He then altered Shannon's terms of freedom and told her that she would be free to go in exchange for oral. Shannon was subsequently SA'd so violently and with such force that the membranes in her mouth had been destroyed. It was then LaMarcus's turn, who then proceeded to violently SA her in both the front and the back. The trauma Shannon endured was so severe that it caused blood to pool internally in her privates. They then dragged her into the living room of the residence, where they continued to violate and beat her. As we mentioned earlier, the men forced bleach down her throat in an attempt to destroy any DNA evidence that they left behind. According to Vanessa Coleman, "They made me go in the back bedroom. When I come back into the kitchen, I seen them tying her up in the fetal position. After the men had her bound, they proceeded to wrap her body in layers of bags and stuffed her body into a trash can in the kitchen, where forensic evidence later proved that she slowly and painfully asphyxiated to death.
The crime was incredibly gruesome, and unfortunately the victims' families wouldn't experience peace for years to come. Their story also had a profound impact on the community and the nation. Despite investigators refuting claims that this crime was racially motivated, the case even caught the attention of certain groups who argued otherwise. Local television stations and newspapers heavily covered the story of the Knoxville area couple. National media outlets like the Associated Press and MSNBC initially reported on the killings. However, a group of individuals took the white nationalist forum stormfront, claiming that there was a media blackout. They believed that the lack of coverage was because Shannon and Chris were white. On May 26, 2007, a group of roughly 30 demonstrators gathered to protest in Knoxville, what they called a rally against genocide. The group was led by Alex Linder, a webmaster and head of the Vanguard News Network. A group of counter-protesters known as the Ku Klux Clowns showed up in white makeup and wedding dresses to oppose the demonstrators. This came to a head when the police arrested the head of the Vanguard News Network. Alex Linder had breached the protest boundaries and got into a physical altercation with the officers, ending with charges being brought against him for disorderly conduct, vandalism, assault on a police officer, and resisting arrest. Despite the out-of-town protesters using the case to stoke racial tensions, the parents of the victims made it clear they wanted nothing to do with the rally and expressed their anger towards the protesters. Gary Christian, who was Shannon's father, said the following statement: "I think any kind of crime like that's a hate crime. Was it racial? No, I don't think so." While the victims' families and communities were trying to grieve, Knoxville authorities had to double down further that the murders were in fact not racially motivated. According to Knoxville Police Chief Sterling Owen, "We have no evidence to support the notion that this was a race-based crime. We see this as a cold-blooded murder."
To make matters worse, far-right political commentator Hal Turner further twisted the tragic story and began targeting the parents of the victims. Also in attendance at the rally, when given the chance to be interviewed, he had this to say:
"Want to sleep? Wake up before 5 o'clock. Outside cleaning up garbage. Then got 6 hours in, went back out, set shop for tomorrow's class. Came back here, got back to work."
Where do you need assistance?
I need an ambulance for my mom and my sister and my boyfriend.
What happened?
It's kind of a long story, and I just need somebody to get here quick, please.
She sounded incredibly frightened and desperately requested an ambulance. It was evident that something terribly serious had unfolded, but the details remained shrouded in confusion. The call isn't just disturbing, but it's also puzzling because it left them with more questions about the situation. To unravel the mystery of that fateful morning, let's delve straight into the case's details. Our story starts from the village of Hoffman Estates, nestled in the heart of Illinois, where there stood a charming house on Bluebonnet Lane. It was the cherished home of the Engelhart family. The family was a small but loving one, consisting of Shelley Engelhart, who, from a very young age, found her heart drawn to the gentle and kind-hearted Alan Engelhart. They set up their new life in the cozy 1000 block of Bluebonnet Lane in Hoffman Estates, where Alan worked tirelessly to provide a better and more comfortable life for his family. In this idyllic setting, another essential member of the family who resided with them was Alan's mother, Marlene Gracek. But the family grew even closer in 1981 when Shelley became a mother, giving birth to a beautiful baby girl with enchanting light brown eyes. they named her Amanda Engelhart. Amanda brought an abundance of love and joy to the Engelhart family. As the first daughter, she was the apple of everyone's eye, but no one could rival the affection showered upon her by her grandmother, Marlene, who took Amanda along on all of her adventures, whether it was a lively party or a simple shopping trip. The Engelhart family's joy continued to grow when, on January 10, 1991, they welcomed a new member to their family, a baby girl, and they